I think we are now left with this very uneasy sense that a kind of progressive justice, quote unquote, is being dealt out to the people that they want to be vindictive against. And I think it's really worrying and disgusting.
In the 1980s, people laughing at political correctness, they always asked me, Frank, when is this idiocy going to end? 10 years later, they were asking the same question.
Now we're in this Disneyfied world of good and evil, and effectively, a slight point of political disagreement is effectively enough to see you ostracised.
The left of British politics can now no longer ignore the fact that most people think the NHS isn't a religion.
We have liftoff.
And welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Alison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. Well, here we are at the Battle of Ideas, Alison, in the heart of Westminster, a two-day political festival now in its 19th year, held at Church House, just next to the Houses of Parliament. Dozens and dozens of sessions, over 400 speakers, a range of topics from domestic politics to economics, international relations, housing, the NHS, music, culture, but the overwhelming overall theme of the Battle of Ideas, and this would be the 20th year, but for lockdown, just saying, is that it's politically heterodox. There are people from all political parties, but I suspect the overall majority of us are from none. We're pragmatic swing voters. And of course, what the Battle of Ideas is all about is free speech, organised as it is under the auspices of the Academy of Ideas, led so admirably by the non-affiliated life peer Baroness Claire Fox. Let's have a cheer for Claire Fox. Woo! Someone who is, of course, well known to Planet Normal listeners. And it's another news tsunami, Alison. So what have we got? We've got Labour about to put another 10 billion quid a year into the NHS this year and next, which Rachel Reeves looks set to announce her October the 30th budget. Is there a budget on October the 30th? I don't say.
Rachel's black hole gets bigger every week.
And at least part of that money is going to be spent not just on Ozempic and Manjaro, despite co-pilot Pearson's efforts, but also on smartwatches to track blood pressure, glucose spikes, and to monitor treatments. If we're going to save the things we love about the NHS, we have to change it, says Wes Streeting. But what kind of change? And just how big is Rachel's black hole, anyway? Then we have Robert Jenrick, desperate to stop Kemi Badenoch becoming Tory leader. He's going to make Jacob Rees-Mogg his chairman, and he says he'll repeal the 2008 Climate Change Act. Will it be enough to win the hearts of Tory members across the country? And why is this Tory leadership contest taking so long? But co-pilot, let's kick off with this Lucy Connelly case. This will be close to the heart of many here at the Battle of Ideas. The wife of a Conservative councillor, after putting some pretty nasty messages out on social media after the horrific murder of those 3 little girls in Southport, was jailed for 31 months. A fair cop, co-pilot, or judicial activism gone mad?
I'm really shocked by this case. I know we do some pretty awful cases on Planet Normal. I'm just going to say 3 names to you. Elsie Stankham, age 7. BB King, age 6, and Alicia De Silvia Aguirre, 9. Okay? Those 3 little girls were murdered on the 29th of July, 2024, and 10 of their mates in this little Taylor Swift dance holiday club were traumatised and stabbed. And something I remember from that day, being from South Wales, was that the suspect was described as Welsh-born. I thought, no, that is not he doesn't belong to our people. He's not my person, all right? No Welsh people are known for running amok with knives amongst primary school children. So I was appalled and shocked and upset, as were millions of British people. And Lucy Connelly, as Liam says, a childminder, 41 years old, a mum living in Northampton. She tweeted something pretty vile, actually, pretty unpleasant, clearly very angry and upset. And Lucy deleted the tweet within about 3.5 hours. It was shared a lot. But I think that lots of people would understand why she was horrified. This isn't a kind of an explanation, but Lucy and her husband did lose their little boy in very, very difficult circumstances with the NHS. So she's a bereaved mother, and she has been given, as Liam said, a 31-month sentence. This is her. She has no criminal record. She pleaded guilty to distributing material with the intention of stirring up racial hatred. We can argue about that. Something that jumped out at me, co-pilot, was the judge, in this case, Judge Melbourne Inman, said when he was sentencing her, it is the strength of our society that it is both diverse and inclusive. And I thought...
That's a really political thing for a judge to say.
That, to me, was a highly political thing to say. What's that got to do with this particular...
I prefer John Inman.
...particular thing?
I'm free.
John Inman, that would be better. And just to add that this same judge was presiding over the case a few weeks after the Southport murders. A mob of Muslim men waving Palestine flags attacked a pub in Birmingham. And they set upon a man who was outside the pub. And this guy, a 19-year-old called Hannah Gaffer, who pleaded guilty to violent disorder. And this same judge who sentenced Lucy Connelly to 31 months gave this chap 20 months. Now, I think probably many people here and most people in British society would think that a lady, a childminder of no previous record, presented less of a threat to the British public than someone who was at the head of a mob in which there were people wielding knives and trying to break into a Birmingham pub where terrified pubgoers sat inside. So this has really upset me, and it's upset me because I think it is vindictive, and I think that the steer has come from our own Prime Minister, who basically said, we're going to clamp down on this stuff. And what underlies this, Liam, to me, is they cannot bear for their multicultural project to be criticised. And Lucy Connelly has fallen foul of that. And so this is a threat now. You watch what you say. Any of you ghastly far-right people, as far as I'm concerned, that's the normal. This is us, isn't it now? This is me. Apparently far-right, mainstream, conservative, sometime Labour voter. So I see it as being politically motivated verdict. I think it's grossly disproportionate. We also know most women who go to jail don't really need to be in jail, and it's extremely bad for their children and their wider family. What did you make of it?
It seemed to me incredibly heavy-handed, and you can both think this is really heavy-handed and think that the original tweet was disgusting, which it was. And yet, let's get this in proportion. 31 months at a time when people are being released from jail who have a history of sexual offence. And I thought I understood a little bit about how politics and the judiciary worked. Us journalists, we're all constitutional experts, aren't we? We're expert in everything.
Well, you are.
As long as it's close to the deadline. No, I don't actually Downing Street were boasting, we went in really hard after the riots on all the sort of Karens who were tweeting, and Keir knows about this stuff. Did you know he was director of public prosecutions?
Did you know he's the son of a toolmaker?
No, I didn't. He never mentions that. By the way,
just to say,
how does it work? I mean, how does a sitting prime minister influence the mind of sitting judges? I don't understand that. Is it some kind of show them a bit of ankle and we'll give you a few more quid for the court and all of this Ministry of Justice negotiations are ongoing? I don't understand how a sitting Prime Minister has anything to do or should have anything to do or can have anything to do with the way judges act. So why are Downing Street bigging themselves up for putting people in jail?
And also, coming back to my original point, just to mention, by the way, on this Tuesday, 1,100 more prisoners are being let out on early release. And as Liam said, they'll include, rapists, sort of domestic abusers. Are we? Yeah. Well, give it time. Give it time. But yeah, so why from this what should be a notorious massacre? We all remember the name of James Bulger, don't we? A little boy, 2-year-old, who was horribly abducted and stabbed and killed. And these little girls, this was a notorious massacre in the heart of our country, in a quiet town in the northwest of our country. absolutely they are airbrushed, and they are pushing the trial of the person who is on trial for the murders of the little girls, pushing it back to late 2025. Funny how they managed to get people that they want to get in very, very quickly, isn't it? So I think we are now left with this very uneasy sense that a kind of progressive justice, quote unquote, is being dealt out to the people that they want to be vindictive against. And I think it's really worrying and disgusting.
I mean, maybe that's the way that Downing Street influences our judges, by the sort of timing of the court and literally manipulation of the Ministry of Justice budget. We know in the run-up to the 30th of October autumn statement, not least because various cabinet ministers are now writing pretty much open letters to the Prime Minister complaining, including the cabinet minister in charge of justice, that there is so little money. If you are the victim of a sexual offence, or you're the victim of some kind of, I hesitate to use the phrase run-of-the-mill crime, then you're going to have to wait till 2026, 2027 to even hear your case heard. And yet, if you tweet in the aftermath of a horrific set of murders which shocked the nation, you're up before the big straight away. How does that work? How about all the quotes run-of-the-mill cases that have been knocked back again because of this? Is it political activism? Again, I don't know how this system is supposed to work, because it seems to me to be working in a way that is, as you say, deeply political.
Yeah, and 1,100 people are released early on Tuesday, while Lucy Connelly, 41-year-old childminder of no previous convictions, is occupying a place in jail. And we might think she doesn't pose a danger to us, while people are being released who do pose a danger to us. So go figure with that as well.
Moving swiftly on, let's talk about the NHS. Obviously, we spoke about it on the last Planet Normal podcast, because Wes Streeting is thinking about bringing in drugs like Ozempic and Manjaro, which we never discuss on Planet Normal ever.
Not that anyone around here is taking it.
Now it seems that Wes is going to buy everyone a smartwatch. Do you even know what a smartwatch is?
Is it like a Fitbit or something? Is it?
Something like that.
I don't know. I'm all for, I think we're bad at preventative medicine in this country, and I think we should do more of it. And I do think there is some merit to helping people struggling with their weight to lose that weight and to feel better about themselves and to get onto a positive pathway. But my concern, Liam, is that these are gimmicks instead of being allowed to see a doctor. Yeah. So suddenly it's like, take your own blood pressure, measure your own, blood sugar.
Give a kid a tablet, but don't bother to sit down and teach him or her to read, right?
Yeah, it seems to me there's a lot of displacement activity, and we on Planet Normal, we were quite hopeful about Wes Streeting. We thought he was one of the more talented members of the Labour the front bench, and we were hoping that he would come in and have the political clout and the will to reform the NHS, which is absolutely crying out for reform. I just want to do a little personal story, which I haven't told you, but my mum, late 80s, has moved to Australia to be with my sister. Last week, about 10 days ago, actually, she fell over and sadly, just a few days arriving in Australia, broke her femur. The ambulance was there within a few minutes, and she was admitted to one of Melbourne's best hospitals. And the doctor said, right, we're going to have to operate on her really quickly in the next 48 hours, or she'll risk being bedbound for the rest of her life. Within 12 hours, my mum had a pin in her hip. She was then discharged, and the next day my sister texted me from Melbourne and said, from 11 to 3, mum's been visited by a doctor, a physiotherapist, an occupational therapist. And I said to my sister, if she was still living in South Wales, she'd still be on the floor outside the bungalow. So that's an example of a health service which is working absolutely brilliantly.
And remains free at the point of use.
Remains free at the point of use. But I'd like to say this. There are loads of British doctors going to Australia to work in a very, very well-funded, part state, part private provision health system, wonderful nurse-to-patient ratios and so on. But here, they think our NHS, we better save this dying model, which is letting down, which is killing 300 people a week. Avoidable deaths. In A&E alone, 300 people die, avoidable deaths every week.
And that's an internally generated number.
That is internally, that's an NHS number. That's not us making that up. So there are thousands of people dying, avoidable deaths. Yeah, unlike everything else. But if you think about it, why do the doctors going to Australia, when they're here, they're opposed to the kind kind of system, which they then gladly embrace when they go to live in the health paradise of Australia. Should we do a Velma stat quickly? Sorry. Anyone who doesn't know Planet Normal, Liam has to do. I'm Velma, he's Shaggy, but he's also Scooby-Doo. So.
But you want to be Daphne with the spray on white
I
boots.
want to be Daphne.
I want to be Fred.
I'm getting more towards Daphne
Fred
now
was
than Velma.
I don't know.
Yeah, a bit.
Do you like Fred?
No, I preferred Shaggy, actually. Let's just look at this. The NHS budget in 2024 is 30 billion more than it was in 2019. It's about 170 billion a year now we pay for a health service which comes in the bottom 2 of 18 developed countries for almost all outcomes, including common cancers. But there are fewer patients being treated than 5 years ago, 17% more staff, but 18% lower treatment in A&E and 12% less surgery. So the idea that Rachel gifting this NHS an extra 10 billion a year, that this is going to transform it's for the birds, Liam, isn't it?
I think it is. And I also think waiting lists are now getting to a point where there is a proper existential crisis. Let's see what happens this winter. But as we pointed out on Planet Normal several times, and of course we're lucky enough to have a very senior contact within the NHS, George, whose gender, can I say the word? We never reveal, though George may be here. And let's give George a round of applause. George is someone who's shown tremendous courage, taken career risks in order to get vital information into the public domain. And let's say, I think George has been a really integral part of Planet Normal over the last few years. But we are in a situation where we don't only have 9 million people on waiting lists, we of course have waiting lists to get on waiting lists. And it's clear now that this system has to change. I do think Wes Streeting, I don't think he's a trailblazer, but I think he's a symptom of where public debate is. The left of British politics can now no longer ignore the fact that most people think the NHS isn't a religion. They think actually it's falling to bits. They desperately want it to do well. They back it heart, mind, body and soul. But it's pretty clear now to everybody who is objective that having Europe's biggest employer, 1.1, 1.2 million people, a huge monolith, is not the right way to run a free at the point of use healthcare system. And there are many, many examples. Alison's given one in Australia. There are many, many countries on the European continent who come up with much, much better healthcare outcomes than we do without all the malarkey of it's our national religion, we're not allowed to touch it. It strikes me, and I say this with regret, as somebody who has many family members who work in the NHS, have worked in the NHS is broken, and it is actually, I think, an enormous producer interest group. And it takes us back to Tony Blair, how right he was, how wrong he was about some things, but how right he was when he said back in the late 90s, and he was pilloried by the left for saying it, of course, that he had the scars on his back from trying to reform this system. And in the end, I'm afraid, the BMA, the doctors' lobby, many of my best friends are doctors. They are, of course they are. But they seem to me to be so stuck in the mud, so recalcitrant now. Yes, of course they do great work. Yes, of course it takes a long time to be a doctor. And doctors can make an awful lot of money, not just in the NHS, but privately too. And lots of doctors are trained massively at the state's expense, and then they go part-time, then 1 day a week, then they don't want to be doctors, they want to go and work somewhere else, and all the rest of it. We can't just keep saying it's okay, the NHS always gets all the money. And even, other ministers now, off the record, are starting to really complain loudly about the amount of money the NHS is getting.
Well, I think people who listen regularly to the podcast will know we were incredibly opposed to the closing of schools during lockdown because we foresaw, didn't take any great shakes to foresee it, that there were going to be huge problems for children being kept out of school. And in fact, there was a statistic a couple of days ago that 1 in 5 children are persistently absent still from school. So that means a lot of knock on. And coming back to the NHS, what Liam was saying, that George, our great source within the NHS, we were saying back in 2020, if it becomes a COVID-only service, which to a remarkable extent it did become a COVID-only service, and that did not happen in other countries. They continued to see patients throughout, and British doctors to some extent pulled down the shutters. And I should say, like Liam, I know quite a lot of doctors. I know some surgeons in Cambridge, and they were so angry that they were not allowed to operate. They were twiddling their thumbs. They were going into the hospital. They weren't allowed to operate. And one guy, who's a very famous surgeon, actually showed me his list. It was teetering ziggurat of files, and he said this is going to be an absolute disaster. And tragically, what we are seeing now is what Professor Carol Sikora and Professor Pat Price said to us years ago on Planet Normal, is the cancers are now, of course, they're coming through now, aren't they?
Because of the lack of screening during the COVID years.
The lack of screening during the COVID years. And the fact is that in our country, it's absolutely, I know we've got to stop being gloomy, but this is dreadful. So if you are diagnosed with cancer today, the target is that you will start treatment within 62 days. But 62 days is laughably bad by international standards. So what we're seeing now, that look over the next year, you're going to see the cancer deaths go right up. And that is because the NHS shut down during COVID, which was terrible, terrible.
Now, we're about to introduce Frank up onto the stage to have a chat. But before we do, Alison, just finally from this top section, Robert Jenrick's come out this morning. He wants to repeal Ed Miliband's Climate Change Act of 2008. What do you think in principle of Tory leadership candidates coming up with policy pronouncements, given that it's unlikely the party's going to be in power for 5 years, though quite likely it will be in power after 5 years, in my view, as we said days after the election.
Yeah,
we said it would be a one-term government. And how do you see this leadership contest? Has Kemi got it in the bag now?
Well, both.
As we all wait for your decision, one way or the other?
Mr. Halligan is very close to Kemi, so we...
Steady.
You know.
I actually live nearer you.
Yes, you do live near me. But
I live in Saffron Walden. She followed me to Saffron Walden. We live like 200 metres from each other, but she followed me there.
We always say we're gonna start recording the podcast. You know those tin cans that we used to have as kids with
Yeah,
bits
with
of
the
string,
string.
with bits of string.
They worked. So did a glass on a wall. That worked.
Kemi has sold herself more on basic Tory principles, hasn't she? And Jenrick has been outlining policies. What I'm encouraged by is that both of them have signalled some cynicism about the net zero targets. I mean, let's forget about arguing about climate change or whatever. The fact is that our timetable, which is enshrined in British law, if you can believe it, to hit this net zero by 2050, it's not going to happen. It's impossible. But in the attempt to get there, we are going to absolutely beggar ourselves. And I don't know if some listeners will know that I've got a sweepstake going as to when Mad Ed's first power cut will happen. Some people are saying Christmas Day, just when everyone's turkey's gone in. So we'll wait and see. But it's a serious point. In the last week, we had 2 squeaky bum times when there was a problem with the interconnectors coming from mainland Europe. So this is very serious. And I think it could be the downfall of Starmer. I think Ed Miliband, I mean, never mind, Ed and David Lammy between them will probably manage to sink the government. What do I think? I think last night, talking to people here, I think there's huge excitement about Kemi. And I admire her fire. I don't know if anyone saw this. This is a nice segue into Frank Furedi, actually. But on the Laura Kuenssberg show last weekend, Laura was basically saying, do you really think that all cultures aren't equally valid? And Kemi shot back. And she said, yeah, child marriage, not equally valid. Women being treated like shit, not equally valid. Topic over. And how great is it going to be to have that woman at the dispatch box punching Starmer's lights out? Sorry, that's just... Now we're going to go on to our amazing Planet Normal guest. Frank Furedi is Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent, the author of 26 books. He's a celebrated social commentator, of course, and Frank will be mentioned in dispatches for his heroic acts of resistance in the ongoing culture wars. Born in Budapest 77 years ago, Frank emigrated with his family from Hungary to Canada after the failed 1956 uprising. He did a degree in international relations in Canada, moving to the UK in 1969, completing an MA in African politics at SOAS, and then doing his doctorate at the University of Kent. This is something I really like about Frank, I didn't know. Like a number of the prominent people fighting back against the current intolerance, Frank started life as a student radical. He was expelled from the International Socialists in 1973 and formed the Revolutionary Communist Group. Then in 1976, he and his followers were expelled from the Revolutionary Communist Group.
Split!
And forming the Revolutionary Communist Tendency.
Monty Python!
Refounded in 1976 as the Revolutionary Communist Party. Anyway, he is a great hero to Liam and I. Welcome, Frank Furedi. Yes, well, welcome. I was loving reading your... Okay, let's just show what we're doing. The War Against the Past. Fantastic book, which I've been reading with huge pleasure. Frank, when you were a revolutionary communist, did you ever think you'd be doing anything as reactionary as urging Western civilization to get a grip and stick up for its own history?
I think so. I always had a soft spot for the Greeks,
Yes.
For the Renaissance, for the Enlightenment. And I always took the view that there was something special about the cultural legacy of the West that was underappreciated. So even in my most radical days, I was a really big fan of Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, Dante. All these people were really important to me. And what has changed, I think the world has changed. And secondly, you go on this journey. When you're as old as me, you go on this political, intellectual journey.
Yes.
And you have no idea where you're going to end up. That's what's so wonderful about it.
Yes.
So I'm quite excited that I went through all these different phases.
You say that the book was born in October 2020 when people remember Black Lives Matter protesters in Portland, Oregon, pulled down a statue of Abraham Lincoln. Of course, we had the defacing of Winston Churchill's statue and the statue of Edward Colston pushed into Bristol Harbour. You said that their target was an inanimate statue of someone who had died more than a century ago. It was as if they had invaded the past to exact revenge on the present. What's going on there, Frank? What are they trying to achieve by pulling down these statues of the great people of the past?
Well, when you look at them, they're a bit like a lynch mob, except they're lynching an inanimate object, which is weird. Yeah. And I think what they really are doing is something that's never happened before, which is not just criticizing the past, but trying to teach the past a lesson. Yes. They're basically saying that we're morally superior to all these little people that lived thousands of years ago, and we are going to tell them how to behave, what values to have. We're more aware than you are. And people who are completely unable to convince anybody of anything in present-day society feel empowered to teach people a lesson who cannot answer back.
Yeah. Liam?
Frank, the fall of the Berlin Wall meant a great deal to me, and I was just a kid living in a crap London suburb, albeit a kid with a paper round who actually read the papers. When I heard that news, I rang a mate and we met at Harwich and we hitchhiked to Berlin. I don't tell you everything, Coco.
No, I know. It's a secret pass.
And that was a definitive moment in my life because it made me, as a sort of mathematical economist, it made me realise that international relations was where it's at, that this was the cardinal political event of my life. And it turned me into a journalist. It turned me into somebody who wanted to see evidence because I read so much nonsense in the papers when I got home about what actually happened in Berlin, and it was not what I'd seen. As somebody with origins, blood, roots behind what was the Iron Curtain, what did the fall of the Berlin Wall mean to you at the time? What were you doing when I was a young undergrad hitchhiking to Berlin?
Well, I was going through a transition. And I regarded the fall of the Berlin Wall as a wonderful moment in my life.
Where were you?
At that point in time, when it actually happened, I was giving a talk in Australia. And I knew that something would happen because a lot of Germans had fled to Hungary, because what they could do is they could go Hungary, cross the border into Austria.
Yeah.
And that basically meant that the wall no longer existed in its pre-existing form. So I knew that something was going to happen. And when it did happen, I thought that this is like the culmination of my aspirations, because having gone through the revolution in '56, I really hated everything about Soviet Union and Stalinism. That was like my big pathology. But the one thing that I always remember is I asked myself, okay, this has happened. Where do we go next? What's going to happen now that the Cold War is more or less over? And the unfortunate thing for me was that although the Soviet Union was defeated, nevertheless it became very clear that Western societies were not really prepared or able to deal with the new situation. They had lived off the fact that they were morally better than the Soviet Union. Didn't have to argue for their way of life because everybody could see how much better they were than the Soviet Union. But now that they had to exist on their own account as the West, they were ill prepared to deal with the moral and existential tensions and questions they were confronting.
And it's an enormous question, enormous set of issues, but just in brief and in the round before Alison comes back in, Frank, how do you think the West has responded to the fall of the Berlin Wall? Have we, and I use the royal we, given the mixed background of so many people in this room, have we done things mostly right as the West, or have we done things mostly wrong?
I think we made one mistake after another. We imagined that just because we were economically more efficient, more superior to the Soviet Union, that was the end-all and the be-all. And we forgot the fact that there was a certain ideological and, more importantly, a moral vacuum that existed in the West, that we no longer knew who we were, where we come from. We were no longer together about our sense of values. And this kind of value-free society that we've created, where nothing was better than something else, basically meant that the West was gradually losing its way, and we're paying the price for that in the current era.
There's a great quote in the book. Let me just read it. "We are witnessing a deliberate attack on those who wish to promote merit and excellence, a deliberate attack on our heritage and our past. And there are those who gnaw away at our national self-respect, rewriting British history as centuries of unrelieved doom, oppression and failure, as days of hopelessness, not days of hope." Certain Mrs. Thatcher.
Possibly, but yeah, I wish.
But I just want to say, because just gnawing away at us,
Yes.
that gnawing away really resonated with me. You've said that Conservatives were lazy and complacent, treating woke as something funny, oh, hilarious, we've got to call it a chairperson rather than a chairman, when actually it was much more dangerous than that.
Yeah, and this goes back a long time. I remember in the 1980s, people laughing at political correctness. And they always ask me, Frank, when is this idiocy going to end? As if some magically it's going to end by itself. And 10 years later, they were asking the same question. When is this going to end? Today, they're asking the question, when is all this trans stupidity going to end? Well, it's never going to end unless we end it ourselves. And that seems to be that seems to be the main lesson I draw from the past, that unless we fight the culture wars, because at the moment the culture wars is one-sided, they're creating the issues, they're taking the initiatives, and we're reacting against it all the time. And as long as you only react, you're not going to win.
What does your background, having lived and frankly come from originally a genuinely totalitarian society or a totalitarian group of countries, of course there are variations within Comecon, within the Warsaw Pact, but what does your childhood teach you, the regime under which you grew up, about this Western debate now on woke?
Well, basically the thing that I've learned is that unless you're prepared to fight, unless you're prepared to open your mouth, unless you stop censoring yourself, things are going to get worse. And I always remember my dad, it was involved in the 56th revolution. He said to me, you know, Frank, there's no point being Hungarian unless you're prepared to fight. because otherwise you lose your culture, you lose your civilization. And I think what he said to me about Hungary is equally the same about Britain.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel really close to Britain at the moment. It's, probably, for me, Britain is my main inspiration intellectually, particularly. And for me, I despair when I see young kids, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, so alienated from their own culture and their own society. And that's, to me, that's the big challenge. We lost 3 generations of kids already to the other side, to the indoctrination. Now we've got to do something to put that right.
During the general election campaign, I was following Nigel Farage in Clacton, and he was being followed by a lot of teenagers, particularly teenage boys. And I spoke to one of them, lovely guy, trainee carpenter, and I said, "Why are you here?" And he said his granddad had just died, who'd been in the Lancaster bomber crew. And he said his granddad had talked about things and had given him a sense that there was this solidarity, a country which felt proud of himself. And he said, he looked to Nigel Farage and he said, he's not afraid. And I thought that's really struck me, that he, whatever we think, and we made different views about Nigel Farage, I thought that this boy, this lovely young boy, was drawn to someone who said, this is a good country. Fundamentally, that his generation, he said at school, they're being told all this stuff that they don't want to hear about. Do you think that's interesting?
Very interesting and very, very important, because whatever you think of Farage, the very fact that he embodies a certain Britishness and a certain orientation towards Britain's past means that at least there are some people around who are able to mobilize that sentiment, that desire to be part of something bigger than you are. And it seems to me that examples of solidarity in this country have been really, really great, which is why we got to protect our past. I mean, look at the way Winston Churchill is being targeted now. It's not an accident that Churchill has become the main target of the culture war. He's kind of denounced as more or less the same as Hitler.
Isn't that the kind of thing you'd have done as a kid? Target a statue like Winston Churchill, an authority figure. It's a serious point. I'm not trying to catch you out. Isn't this just, the usual student pranks, or is there something more going on?
I think there's a difference between student prank and heckling. I used to be a professional heckler. And I think that in any democracy you need hecklers. That's very different than when you shut a discussion down and when you basically project this hatred towards not just an individual, but a whole way of life that has existed, that pre-existed the world as it is today. Because what's happening today is people are saying that everything about Britain's past is a story of shame. And we should feel guilty about everything that our ancestors have done. And if you have that attitude, then you destroy the connection between the generations, and that will mean that young people will be so disoriented that they will find it very difficult to make their way, which is the example that Alison gave. It's so important, because there are young people, I met quite a few of them, who feel inspired by certain politicians. And I think that as long as there is a small group of individuals of that generation, they can create a bit of momentum around a particular way of life, a particular set of values.
I was reading the book. It's a fantastic book, by the way. Everyone should buy it and read it.
What does the rest of the world think about what we're doing in the West, spending all our time on this utter nonsense? We've got demographic issues to deal with. We're spending more on debt interest than we spend on schools. Yeah? The morality of that. We're trying to reconfigure our relationship with the rest of the world. We're desperately trying to get our economy moving. It's still in second gear after the global financial crisis, which is a completely self-imposed crisis. Meanwhile, our political media class is obsessed with pronouns. How's this going down in China, in Russia, in Iran?
Well, I think in China they're kind of pissing themselves. They think this is weird and a good result that the West is behaving in this way. But the really bad news is, I do a lot of work in Brussels, is that throughout the European Union, gender mainstreaming is being universalized. And the language police is really very, very active in most of the Western European countries. Things are not as bad as in England. I mean, England is the worst place other than America.
Canada.
And Canada is not a country anymore. But there is this. Well, it's true. I mean, if you go to Canada, it is many, many countries where people have got the most idiotic ideas about everything, and the normal. They actually think that if you use words like he and she, and you insist on the binary, then in some shape or form, you are morally inferior to them, that somehow you can be laughed at and negated. Canada has become, and I say this having grown up in Canada, it's unrecognizable as a society to what it was. And that shows you that if you allow this madness to acquire its own momentum, it does have a totally corrosive effect on everyday life.
Well, on that note, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Frank Furedi is the author of The War Against the Past, just his latest book. Let's give him a Planet Normal round of applause. And our next guest, ladies and gentlemen, is Andrew Doyle. He's a playwright, a journalist, a political satirist, creator of the fictional online character Titania McGrath. He is also, of course, one of the creators of Comedy Unleashed, of which I'm a huge fan, a kind of underground network of stand-up gigs well worth going to. And he presents and oversees headliners on a channel called GB News. I've never actually heard of it. To call Andrew multi-talented is to underplay the breadth of his various activities, and yet annoyingly, for someone who does so many things, he's a really nice guy and he never seems to be in a hurry. He's the author of several books, including Free Speech and Why It Matters, 2021, and of course the new Puritans, which came out in 2022. The co-pilot here, she once wrote a book called I Don't Know How She Does It, which was made into a film with Sarah Jessica Parker and Piers Brosnan. You know what? I don't know how Andrew Doyle does it, all the things he does. But let's give him a round of applause. Andrew, great to have you here on the rocket of right thinking. I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you is, how do you do it all? Are there 2 Andrew Doyles, 3 Andrew Doyles?
No, I think when you've alienated most of your friends, it frees up a lot of social time, basically. It's true. I went through my phone sort of deleting... Is this okay? Can you?
Yeah, it's fine.
I went through my phone sort of deleting all the numbers of the people who no longer talk to me. And no, I don't want sympathy. It's really helped. I've got so much time now to get on with work.
Yeah. You said actually, didn't you? I think in the New Puritans, you said that the parents of your godson. The dad described you as a fascist, didn't he, or something?
Yeah,
he knows who you are. He knows you're not a fascist.
Well, I mean, yeah, you would think. Otherwise, why would he
give you...
elect me to protect his son from Satan?
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's how I opened that book.
Yes.
Is this confrontation in a Soho pub where he was sitting there and his wife was there, who I've known for many, many years.
Yeah.
Best friend.
Yeah.
And they just out of nowhere start screaming at me that I'm a fascist. And partly it was because I was satirising a political view that they supported. It's insane. So I kind of think that since that 2016, since Brexit and Trump, that sort of concatenation of those two things, everyone sort of lost their sanity a little bit. And now we're in this world of this Disneyfied world of good and evil. And effectively, a slight point of political disagreement is effectively enough to see you ostracised.
Yeah.
I do want to ask you about the comedy scene, because you are, I think, at the very cutting edge of British comedy, along with Andy Shaw, I think is probably in the audience, who is also one of the masterminds behind Comedy Unleashed. But before we get onto that, let's just deal with some of the mad headlines we've seen recently. What did you think, Andrew? What do you think at 31 months for Lucy Connelly?
Yeah.
I think it proves that we don't live in a free society. I think it's absolutely outrageous. And more than that, I think it's deeply, deeply disturbing. I think Starmer has proven over and over again that his government is an authoritarian government. The scotching of the Higher Education Free Speech Act the day before Parliament went into recess, so they couldn't have a debate on it, a thing that had cross-party support and been worked on for many years. Complete political vandalism.
And just before you go, that is so unusual, an act.
Yeah.
That's an act. It's not a bill that hadn't been passed yet, or it was an act. And to repeal an act before it's actually been implemented is very unusual.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Starmer has form on this. He's, when he was the director of public prosecutions, he's the one who was responsible for the modification of the language. So we now talk about victims rather than complainants, for instance. So completely bypassing due process, and that legacy is still retained. He doesn't recognise that there's a problem with free speech. He is part of the problem with free speech. 31 months in prison. I mean, I was interviewing Greg Lukianoff yesterday on my show, who's an American academic, And he said, it couldn't happen in America, for one thing. People wouldn't stand for it. But this is insane. He was talking to people at this conference who were saying, no, it's not so bad here. He's like, what are you talking about? People are going to prison for what they say. That's bad. That should never happen. I mean, in her case, because I saw Boris Johnson was writing about it, saying, well, she should have maybe got a fine or community service. I don't think so. I don't think that either. I think anything that we say or choose to say, once the state is imprisoning citizens for what they choose to say or think, then you are in authoritarianism, as far as I can see. You would need to prove, and I'd love for someone in here to explain to me why, or to justify the idea of a woman having almost 3 years in prison, or any prison time, for a comment on social media that was deleted within 3 hours. You would have to prove a causal link between the things she said and actual real-life violence. No such link exists. We've bought into this strange fantasy, and politicians have bought into it, that things that are said online, that the public act on cue mechanically to things they see online. We saw it back in Brexit when you had people saying that Russian bots swung Brexit, or because people saw something on a bus, they voted Brexit. No, there were months and months of political debate, the likes of which I've never seen in my lifetime, actually. People understood this more than any other issue they'd voted on. So you would have to prove that causal link, but luckily we've had 6 decades, more than 6 decades, into media effects theory. It has been debunked. There is no connection between popular culture or what people read online and how they act in the real world. It's factually not true. So why are we having... I tell you what else is very disturbing. No politician is going to stand up on her behalf. No politician is going to say...
Well, but Boris has written in...
He has, but he's also said she should have got a fine, should have got community service. But I want someone in Parliament to stand up and say, we need to do something about this, change the law, repeal the hate speech laws, which are currently encoded in the Public Order Act and the Communications Act. Just acknowledge, get our politicians to acknowledge that stupid and horrible things that people say online, which it was, don't have real world effects. People are human beings, they make mistakes. Why can't we even have that conversation? Why are we pursuing legislation on the basis of something that has been debunked decades ago?
It also may be a way of letting off steam, mayn't it?
Could be anything.
People tweet something, and of course it's ridiculous or not, not very pleasant. I mean, you actually say I hadn't read, and I've read with great pleasure Andrew's wonder. It's a beautiful book, this Free Speech and Why It Matters, and I'm buying 2 copies to put in my woke children's Christmas stocking. It'll serve them right. But you say in the book, it's a book of sweet reason, and honestly, I think a lot of us live in this kind of desert where there's just constant lunacy, and it's just a joy to read this articulation of things that we know are very, very important. So you say in the book, don't you, that Orwellian has become something of a cliche, and yet things are constantly happening, that Orwellian is the only word to describe them. And you have a lovely phrase, actually. You say we are left facing that confusing phenomenon, the well-intentioned authoritarian. So it also overlaps with Frank as well, because there's this be kind, isn't it?
Yes.
So this Lucy Connelly, obviously a bad person, said something which the liberal consensus is this is a wicked person, and yet now this incredibly vindictive punishment against her. So
Yes.
all the nice people can feel we're not like horrible woman from Northampton. Is that what it is?
So maybe that's the purpose. I mean, the judges in some of these cases where people are going to prison for memes are explicitly saying in the court proceedings, we are giving you the most severe sentence in order to set an example for other people.
Yes.
So that is being explicitly stated. So if that is the point, then I suppose it's to send out a message and say, you'd better not say these horrible things. It can't be that they genuinely believe that she has actually incited violence or stirred up violence against a protected group. If that were the case, for instance, when the BBC put out their false reporting saying that the IDF had deliberately targeted medics at a hospital in Gaza, which is playing into anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and likely to stir up hatred. Yes, they did admit it was a mistake and retracted it and apologised, but that's far more severe going out on the national broadcaster than someone on Twitter. So someone at the BBC would now be in prison for 31 months if it were the case that that is the rationale behind it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
One important valve in society, Andrew, as you say, is free speech, and the debate about where you draw the line between absolute free speech and total censorship will go on and on. It strikes me we've definitely gone away from the ideal a disturbingly long way. But another valve is comedy. you're such an interesting character, if I may say so. You've got a DPhil from Oxford in English literature, and yet you created this astonishing Twitter character called Titania McGrath. I think a lot of people in the room have followed Titania on X, as we must now call it, for many, many years. How did you have that idea? Because you were really quite early to Twitter X, the use of social media. How did this bookish Oxford academic come to be a social media phenomenon?
But I was always a stand-up comedian, first and foremost, I think. And so I wanted to... There was this thing in society that comedians weren't really mocking. I mean, a few were, but not many. And if you did, you'd have other comedians in green rooms telling you better not, you shouldn't be saying that, and being really disapproving and oddly puritanical. And of course, the battleground was Twitter. And there were some brilliant satirical accounts on Twitter, and I was really inspired by them. And I thought, well, I wanted her to be a slam poet. I wanted her to, because you know how terrible slam poetry is. and it's that sort of, no, I'm sorry if you're a fan, but it's that kind of inverse relationship between the quality of the thing and the extent to which the person delivering it thinks they're a genius. And I thought she would think she's brilliant.
Yeah.
And she would be posh and rich, but constantly complain about her lack of privilege, which I thought that was always very funny, because most of the people who were making the most noise about it were all like upper middle class with double-barreled surnames. I thought it was really funny. And that she would find offence in absolutely everything. In other words, I would try and just ape and mimic what I was seeing, and it had to be on Twitter, didn't it? Because that was where they were doing it. But what I didn't know is that most of the things she said would come true, which I thought was absolutely... that has really upset me.
It is truly beyond satire, isn't it?
When she was talking about Helen Keller's white privilege in her book, I didn't realise that suddenly a mainstream magazine would say the same thing 2 years later. The most extreme thing I could think of, they would always top. They would always go further.
We have a game in our house with my husband where we look at the front page of the Daily Telegraph and we always say, headlines you could never have imagined 25 years ago. And mostly it's all of them, because it's always something like school says man is none or something. You think, sorry? I mean, it's every aspect of it is mad.
If you think of the Rip Van Winkle test, if any of us had fallen asleep 15 years ago and working out, how would we understand today? Like, what the police are investigating non-crime? What's going on? What the government's legislating on the basis of a gender identity, a spiritual sexed soul?
Come, Andrew, non-crime hate incidents.
Non-crime hate incidents. Well, the police shouldn't be investigating non-crime any more than your doctor should be phoning up and saying, I hear you're really healthy at the moment.
But something where you and Frank have a big overlap now is sort of education and literature, because we've just seen our Prime Minister who's taking the portraits down off the number 10 walls as fast as he can manage, anyone he feels inferior to, which is obviously starts with Margaret Thatcher. And this week it's supposed to be William Shakespeare.
Yeah.
I mean, what do we do about the fact that the greatest ever exponent of the English language is banished to the cupboard by Keir Starmer, who is probably one of the worst exponents of the English language?
Well, I'd love for him to explain why. I mean, I've read the article in the Telegraph about what the taking down of the portrait of William Shakespeare, but there's no statement from the government explaining their reason. So we're left in a sort of mystery. I mean, they took down Margaret Thatcher, which I can understand. He's just jealous, probably. But taking down Elizabeth I, well, we're surmising that it's because she was a stakeholder in one of the slave voyages, the John Hawkins voyage. Maybe it's that, as Frank writes about, this sort of war on the past. This attack on the statue. Elizabeth I is probably next. The oldest statue in London is the one on Fleet Street of Elizabeth I. That'll probably come down at some point. So is it that, or why is he taking down Walter Raleigh? What else is he taking down? There's a few others, aren't there?
Yeah.
And the Shakespeare one is baffling. I'd love to hear why. I can only assume he thinks that Shakespeare represents nationalism, I suppose. But the thing about Shakespeare as a writer is he doesn't represent anything.
No.
So, I mean, there's absolutely...
And who is he writing for?
Right. We don't know anything
the
about...
groundlings.
We don't know his opinions on anything. You can look in his plays for anything to support your worldview, but the play can easily be flipped against your worldview. There's a really interesting story about a production of Coriolanus in the 30s in France, where you had groups of Republicans turning up, groups of... opposing factions cheering on the lines that supported their own particular view, because the play supports both depending on how you read it. We just don't know. Even when Laurence Olivier did his version of Henry V, which was funded by the government during wartime to stir up nationalism, he had to take out sections that would undermine it because the king in that play is a morally ambiguous figure. Shakespeare can't be pinned down like this. No. So the idea that Starmer would perceive him as representative of, I suppose, a right-wing or nationalistic viewpoint doesn't bear scrutiny.
Can I just say that there's a big literature about the fact that Shakespeare is the father of white supremacy. And seriously, and there is all these scholars who are discovering white supremacy within his different plays. So that may be the reason.
Oh yeah, there's loads of people. So the Globe Theatre now, the Globe and the RSC, who are meant to be the custodians of Shakespeare's legacy, are the worst vandals of his legacy. And currently, the Globe has every year it has anti-racist Shakespeare webinars. So basically, I can't believe people do that voluntarily and not as a punishment. But you sit there with academics who sort of berate you for liking Shakespeare. Emma Rice, who was artistic director of Globe, admitted she didn't like Shakespeare. Well, don't apply for the job, Emma. And also that queer theorist going on about how the problematic elements of Shakespeare wrote 126 love sonnets to another man. I mean, look, if you've got a problem with the gays, don't start there.
At least one man. It could have been multiple men and multiple women, couldn't it?
I suppose so. But we don't know. We don't know what his sexuality was. We don't know what his opinions were. We don't know anything. There's a co-opting of historical figures for your political view is a dead end.
But as Frank says, it is the utmost historical arrogance, isn't it, to think that all points of history and literature were leading to marvellous us.
I love that. So the best thing about the online social justice activists, they've got this idea that the whole of human history was just a litany of mistakes, everyone getting it wrong. Finally, we've turned up and we've got it.
Now I've been born.
Exactly.
Now I've got a 2-2 in languages.
Yeah. Like Titania did a tweet about that. I can't remember exactly, but Titania wrote something like, the great thing about being a social justice, being on the right side of history, is I know that no one in the future will ever laugh at what I've done or say that I got it wrong. It is the way they think. It's incredible hubris.
We're going to move on to question and answer very soon. Hopefully there's some mics in the audience. If not, you'll have to speak up. But keep your questions really short and sweet so we can hear as much as possible from me. Andrew, before we do go to Q&A, let's just think about the comedy that you grew up with, that we all grew up with, compared to the comedy now. We have got ourselves in a mess in so many ways, not least in the way we use language. To what extent do you think mainstream comedy is failing us as a society, and what are you trying to do about it?
It's always difficult, isn't it? Because you don't want to because comedy ages more than any other medium. And so you don't want to be the sort of person to say, things aren't funny anymore, because tastes change and ideas change and all the rest of it. And that's always been the case. If you go back to Aristophanes in The Clouds, there's a character whinging about the way young men, they're so dissolute, they're always taking hot baths. You don't want to be that person. But on the other hand, I mean, I'd like to draw a distinction there between comedy and satire, really, insofar as I think the satirist is the individual who wants to change things, or who thinks things can be changed. I think the comedian is the thing who just thinks, everything's terrible, so I may as well laugh at it. And that's a sort of fundamental distinction, I think. I think mostly, at the moment, the truth is that the comedians are parroting an establishment line for establishment approval, and so they're not in any way satirical. And I suppose that's something that I despair of, insofar as when you have these closed systems of thought prevailing, comedians and satirists have always taken aim at them, irrespective of their own view. I mean, look, I spent 3 years co-writing that Jonathan Pye character, which was singularly taking aim at the right and Trump and the Tories. And then I start taking aim at the left-wing targets. Suddenly, that's ridiculous. Why are you doing that? You're an evil monster. You're a fascist, etc.
But the point you make, of course, in your book is that when I was a child, it was the right was always trying to close things down, and from the Lady Chatterley trial and so on. And Frank writes about this as well. So it's gone from the right being the people trying to stop free speech to now it's firmly of the left, and so therefore it's righteous, isn't it?
So I think that's a really interesting point, and I think it's worth remembering that authoritarian instinct is something that is, I think, embedded in humanity generally, irrespective of your political affiliations. And I think it comes back and forth. I mean, I don't think the right are particularly great on free speech either. I think, when Trump talks about suspending CBS's broadcasting license, even though such a thing doesn't exist, you kind of think, well, yeah, they were wrong to selectively edit that interview with Kamala Harris, but to jump to I want them stopped is a problem. Tim Waltz in his debate, of course, said that he thought the First Amendment didn't cover hate speech. That's a scary thing for him to admit. And I noticed that doesn't appear in the official transcript on CBS, by the way.
Okay.
But he did say it. But yeah, I think what this points to is authoritarian. It'll go back and forth. When I was a kid, it was the right-wing papers, the Daily Mail, the Express, saying let's ban train spotting or whatever it might be.
Crash.
Last Temptation of Christ, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And now, of course, it's the Guardian and the New Statesman and those sort of activist publications saying we need to censor scenes in the BBC or whatever. If you watch that episode of Fawlty Towers, the Germans on BBC iPlayer, there's a whole scene cut at the moment because the people at the BBC think it's not good for you to see that. So I think it's both sides. At the moment, you're right. It's predominantly those who identify as left-wing who are the most censorial. Tomorrow it'll be the right again. Like it'll go back and forth. You've just got to be vigilant, I think.
Before we ask the questions, can I just ask Frank one small question? You came from Hungary as a child. The Hungary now, Viktor Orban, which some might argue is far right, but is defending its culture like crazy. So what do you think about that? Is that too extreme, or do you see a Hungary which is actually trying to preserve its national identity?
I think Hungary is struggling because you're bombarded by Netflix, by Hollywood. You get all these essentially woke ideals being the norm in the West. And the EU is demanding that these principles, these ideals should be respected in Hungary. And I think the Hungarian government and the Hungarian society has got every right to insist that this is not what we signed up to. So I think what they're doing is an interesting experiment. And the Hungarian government is not composed of angels. They make a lot of mistakes, just like anywhere else. But by and large, I think it's lovely to see an attempt to kind of retain what is traditional about Hungarian culture and to take that very, very seriously while still being open to new experience. So I think they're getting the balance right, but sometimes, as Andrew was saying, they can make mistakes just as much as anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Just before we move on to Q&A, ladies and gentlemen, let's have a round of applause for the one, the only, Andrew Doyle. Okay, let's have some questions. There's a lady with her hand up at the back.
Everybody for all that. It'd be nice to talk about the funny stuff and mention comedy geniuses of the past like Caroline Aherne, but Shakespeare is something I'd like to pick up on because I was talking to a third-year student at a Russell Group university this week, and just to probably corroborate what you've been saying, it's now possible to get an English degree at a Russell Group leading university in the Midlands without writing a single sentence on Shakespeare. Okay, just for your information.
What do you think of that, co-pilot?
Oh, I'm still recovering. About 10 years ago, I met a young woman who was doing a degree, and she explained to me that it was wrong to read all of Middlemarch because it would impede your ability to answer the question. So, but yeah, I mean, imagine doing English literature without doing Shakespeare. What an impoverishment, It's just, one of my favourite poems, I've never told you this, it's Ben Jonson, who was a great, great writer, but Ben Jonson had the bad luck, like Salieri was born in Mozart's era, and Ben Jonson, a brilliant writer, was
like Andy Murray,
born in Mr. William, and he wrote a poem on Mr. William Shakespeare, and he just said, a monument not for now but for all time, and it's the most beautiful, gracious, witty tribute to another writer who's better than you. And I think the idea that people are studying English literature. He's always competitive with me about English literature. But what do you guys think? You've been teachers. Imagine that. Imagine, I want every child to have some exposure to their greatest national poet and playwright. I mean, there's no reason why not, because the stories are fantastic, aren't they?
Well, what you're saying is bad, but what's even worse is that a lot of places, they're rewriting Shakespearean plays. So, for example, they're arguing that we got to change the language to make it more explicitly racist, to bring out Shakespeare's assumption. So they're not happy with Othello just being black. They got to make it sound really horribly racist, because that way we understand what Shakespeare really meant. So the arrogance that I know better than Shakespeare did, what he really thought about black people, is a very good example of what we're discussing here, and the way that Shakespeare then becomes this tabula rasa on which you can reinvent this individual and at the same time project your own prejudices onto a 16th century character.
How have we ended up, Andrew, in this situation? You've spent a lot of time knocking around university. So of all of us on this panel, how have we got to this point where there are leading academics at Russell Group universities who think it's okay for English literature graduates not to read Shakespeare?
It's been going on for a while. I mean, you can, for a number of years now, you've been able to qualify from Yale University in English without reading Shakespeare. It is incredibly arrogant, and it's based on this assumption, I think, which was revealed in a promotional video by Sheffield University about 5 years ago, where they effectively said, we only study people like Chaucer and Shakespeare because they're dead white men, or Virginia Woolf because she's white. And they effectively reduce everything to the notion of group identity monomania. That's the fundamental aspect of this new religion. And that, unfortunately, is the prevailing doctrine within universities. And of course, if you read something as abundant as Shakespeare and you only can read it through the lens of group identity, you're not really reading Shakespeare at all, which is why 99% of modern productions of Shakespeare are absolutely terrible, because they're all... No, I'm all for reinterpreting Shakespeare and doing it creatively and doing whatever you want with the text. But when every major theatre company is doing the same thing with those texts, which is to reduce it to a moral sermon on group identity, then it's incredibly banal and impoverishing for the artistic landscape.
Oh, lots of...
Gentleman here, the front. Yeah.
Can I do that?
Thank you. Yes, hi. Predictions. The American election, whether it goes one way or the other, how will that affect any of the issues we've discussed here today?
Good question. Frank, what do you think of that?
I don't think it will have a big impact because the culture wars took off under Reagan and Thatcher. They were two conservative prime ministers who had no idea what's happening in everyday society and cultural institutions, and it spread. And I don't think that politicians can do very much here. I think the cultural war has got to be fought culturally rather than politically, because there's a danger that you end up doing the very same thing that the other side is doing by using your own method of indoctrination, using your own form of censorship, trying to basically react with the same instruments. And what I worry about is that neither the Republican Party nor the Conservative Party has got a clue what is it it's up against. I also worry about the fact that if you talk to conservatives and you ask them in this country or in America, would you like your son or your daughter to become a teacher? Oh, no. That's look at the school system. It's really horrible. I'd rather they went into the city. And of course, what they're really saying is that we'll leave your children in the hands of people who are indoctrinating them, rather than trying to encourage our own kids to become teachers and to play a role in socializing young people.
Andrew, who's the easier, the better, more useful target for satirists? A return President Trump or Kamala Mamala?
Oh, definitely Kamala, because Trump is funnier than most comedians. So, yeah, absolutely. But you shouldn't vote on that basis anyway. But I'd say...
It seems to be the most rational basis on which to vote. When you look at
Isn't it depressing that it's always a vote between the lesser of two evils? That to me is really awful. I think when it comes to the culture war, I think Frank is absolutely right. Neither side is really able to grapple with this because neither side has made the effort to understand it. All of the problems that we're facing in society in terms of the culture war were presided over by the Tories. And yes, it's true that Labour are accelerating the process. So you're choosing between the speed of the process rather than anyone who's willing to impede it. You'll probably get the same in America. I mean, I come back to this point of, if we were serious, had a political landscape that was serious, we would have a debate in Parliament and we'd say, look, we're pushing through all of these policies in schools and in the NHS that assume that there is such a thing as gender identity. Can we have a debate about what does gender identity mean? Does it exist? And if it does not exist, let's stop legislating as though it does. I mean, I had a trans campaigner on my show. I asked for a definition, and this person said it's an essence of male and female. So why do we have school curriculum based on some supernatural idea? Have we even had the debate? No, because they don't understand the issues.
Another question?
There's a gentleman there, and then a gentleman there.
Yeah.
Hello. Yep. You were talking about the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the post-Fukuyama world, and it seems to me that we lost our external threat. Is that does Western civilization, or do all civilizations, need an external threat to perpetuate themselves? And, since we've turned in on ourselves, I think you used a very interesting phrase, Frank, in your book, which was grievance archaeology.
Yes.
And I think, does that explain the mediocrity we have in everything, in both politics, bureaucrats, even individuals who are blaming their situation on the past rather than looking forward?
Brilliant questions. Gentleman there.
My name is Wayne, longtime Planet Normal listener from back in the dark days. I'd like to follow up on the discussion that Frank mentioned earlier about the vandalism of the statues that people found problematic and that were celebrating monuments and celebrating something that they don't want to be reminded of or that they think is bad. I was in Budapest, and in Budapest, what they did with their statues left by the Russians was to take them all and put them in a park on the outskirts of town with a frontage, an entrance of which looks, to my eyes anyway, looked a lot like the entrance to a concentration camp. And then you walk through this archway and all those statues are there. It's really extraordinary. And if you're ever in Budapest, I recommend that you go there. You can also buy a souvenir. You can let little wax candle busts of Stalin and Marx, which you can burn, and then they will melt down. My question to you in that regard was that the right thing to do with the statues? Or are there statues and public monuments of that nature that really do become problematic? And if so, are there more intelligent things to do with them than haul them down and throw them in the river?
Brilliant questions. Frank, external threat.
External threat, no. I don't think we need an external threat because we become our worst enemies anyway. And I think one of the lessons of history, and this goes back to the Roman Empire, days of the Roman Empire, is that we got the capacity to not take ourselves seriously and gradually unravel as a society, which is what we're doing at the moment. We don't need Chinese or Islamist terrorists to do the bad job for us. We can do that ourselves.
Can I just say quickly, I know it's a kind of contentious area, but I had about a month ago, I had a trip to Israel to write for the anniversary of the 7th of October, lots of harrowing interviews, but very interesting meeting younger people there, even younger people in the IDF who are very nuanced and mature for their years and no evidence of anxiety or any of these worries about this thing. And I thought they don't have the luxury of being frivolous. They have to focus on, survival. So I did think that had made them a different kind of young person, notably different from 20-somethings in this country. That's what I would say.
I would love to send, if I had a son, 16, 17, 18, I'd love to send them join the Golan Brigade and become a man, because you can still have that accomplishment done for you relatively easily.
Can I just come back on what the gentleman was saying about the scrubbing of the statues? And this is something that I think really should disturb us more, this revisionist tendency among activists to modify the past in accordance with what they wanted it to be, this year zero idea. So disturbing. And because you mentioned Orwell, and I said it's become a cliche, but that's Winston Smith's job. Is to go through old newspapers and remove and modify what the past was. So we should be aware that there's a warning from history here. And, I've heard people try and defend it, with the Colston statue. I think I heard Mary Beard saying, yes, but the Romans were iconoclastic. Yes, but they had a thing called Damnatio Memoriae, where they would scrub away emperors like Geta and Caligula and Domitian and all the worst ones and pretend they never happened. But that's not just because they did it doesn't mean that's a good precedent and we should be emulating it, because surely Mary Beard, of all people, would be rather delighted if those monuments were still around, actually. And we should be thinking in terms of not pretending that the history was different than it was, and learning from it, I suppose.
On the external threat, I think we don't need an external threat to be a functioning society, but I think a lot of vested interests in society need an external threat. And I think for any mainstream economist to deny that, for any mainstream political commentator not to have read and absorbed and understood President Eisenhower's resignation speech or his leaving speech as he left the White House is naive. It is not controversial to understand that there are big vested interests across the world who want and make their living, such as it is, from external threats. The gentleman there.
I'd like to ask a question on the current Tory leadership election. Like many in the audience here today, I did start out on the left, as we all did when we were younger. And as the sort of tectonic plates started to shift under our feet, and what we thought we believed in didn't occur. So we moved gradually towards the right, to what we thought was the solid ground of the Conservative Party, only to find they were going the other way, and they were going back towards the left. Now, the two current contenders are both saying, sorry, not as, we're going to do it differently. Why should we believe them?
Good question. Question there?
I'm based in Scotland, so I'm really hoping that some of you guys down in London might be able to run with this. So
It's all right, we'll call up Brian the Fisherman, the Triangle Toast Eaters.
So I'm with the Scottish Union for Education, and we found out, and as far as we can tell this is true, I've now put in a Freedom of Information request to the school, that there's a 9-year-old in a London school who has been reported to Prevent and is now going on a 6-week training course because the teacher put up 3 pictures, Taylor Swift, Martin Luther King and Adolf Hitler, and said, which one would you choose as a hero? And a 9-year-old boy chose Adolf Hitler. He's been sent on a 6-week Prevent training course, right? And I thought this can't be true, but then I looked it up, and of course Prevent does. So I've also asked the Metropolitan Police if they can send me figures about how many 9-year-old children they've sent to Prevent training courses. And as you're saying, it's like Titania McGrath, you couldn't make it up, the headlines in the Telegraph. I still can't believe it, but it seems to be true. I mean, it's part of the Prevent framework, is we're now going to train, so we'll probably train kids who are misogynistic, apparently, at the age of 6, that are homophobic at the age of 7. Who knows in the framework of Labour? It's astonishing. But anyway, if anyone wants to run with this story in London, it would be quite nice.
Wow.
Andrew Doyle, truth is stranger than fiction and real life is funnier than satire. You're out of a job.
Oh, I know. I interviewed Bernard Randall, who's a chaplain at a school in Derby recently on my show, and he went to a staff training session where all of the staff, by a visiting speaker, were told to chant "smash heteronormativity," and as a clergyman, he thought that might be against his tribe, and he didn't. And he was reported to Prevent because he then gave a sermon saying to the kids, we need to be able to discuss these issues and not necessarily automatically agree with things like that. He was reported to the Anti-Terrorist Monitoring Society of the government. And then they had that boy in West Yorkshire who brought a copy of the Quran into school and scuffed it, was reported to the police, got slapped with a non-crime hate incident. This is a child damaging his own book. It's got nothing to do with the state. So absolutely, all of this stuff is worse than satire.
It sounds like 1950s Hungary, Frank. Can you concur?
No, 1950s Hungary was more liberal, actually.
There's the headline. Be careful how you write it. Frank, that's a pretty big statement. Do you really mean that?
Oh, I do, because in Hungary, indoctrination never had the impact that it does in England at the moment. So most people would come back home and they would laugh at all the Soviet and Stalinist propaganda, and there'd be loads and loads of jokes about the latest idiocy of the government. Whereas today here in England, not very many people laugh about pronouns, not very many people laugh about the fact that young 9-year-olds are treated like terrorist adults. So all these things that are, to us, obviously ludicrous and idiotic, are no longer matters for jokes and for satire, whereas in Stalinist Hungary they were. And I think that's a huge difference. It indicates that that level of propaganda never permeated everyday life.
I still believe, maybe wrongly, maybe hopefully, that the vast majority of British people find a lot of this stuff absolutely ludicrous, and that they're just not, they're intimidated because the sort of, the Laura Koonsberg class saying to Kemi, do you really think some cultures are more valid than others? Everybody thinks some cultures are more valid than others. That's why we're living here and not living in Iran, isn't it, really? So I think that actually, I still hope that there are millions of planet normal citizens who actually just, if you push came to shove, they don't want their children being taught this pernicious nonsense. They don't want their children being taught about white privilege. Actually, the funniest one I heard was actually from Alka Segal-Cuthbert, who many of you will know, wonderful from Don't Divide Us. And Alka said that someone had sent a picture of all these sort of racism books in this primary school. And she said it was in a primary school in the Fens where there weren't any non-white children. And all the children who were there were Eastern European anyway. So everyone was completely baffled by this book display of anti-racism. So So, it's...
I think you're right, but there's a lot of self-censoring going on.
There is a lot of self-censoring.
And that is a big danger for us.
I also think Frank's completely right that there's a complacency. We've had this thing about Lucy Connelly, someone going to prison for that. Is anyone going to do anything? Is anyone going to say anything? No, I don't think they are. And I think you're right.
I would like to go and stand somewhere and object.
What good would it do when neither political party is willing to even discuss the issue? And there's that sense of, I think, what Frank is describing is we just kind of now accept it. Yeah, some people go to prison for offensive things. Yeah, you read a BBC article about this horrific murderer, serial killer, and you think, wow, this doesn't sound like a woman, but okay, it's a woman. And then the penultimate paragraph, it's a man. So the writer thinks they're writing an Agatha Christie novel with a twist. There's a twist at the end. But we just accept it now. It's like, wait a minute, our national broadcaster is just lying to us about the sex of the perpetrator, and we're just like, oh, well, yeah, but that happens now. I think it is worse.
It may be that the Lucy Connelly case it's already a cause célèbre among the chattering classes, if you like, but it may be that becomes, politicians do become engaged. I mean, taking my life into my hands, there's the moral equivalence is completely different, of course. But look at the Lucy Letby case. You've now got very serious people questioning this. People like David Davis, for instance, who's got a tremendous track record of sort of judicial campaigns, if you like. It may be that if people like us keep talking about it, ordinary people will think, well, yeah, she did a really stupid tweet. I don't condone the tweet at all. She should have been told, I think she should have been told to take it down at some stage. But 31 months.
Yeah, but the difference is that no politician is going to risk defending someone who said that thing,
that's right.
Which she did actually say.
She did.
Because there's this interpretation that if you support free speech for terrible things, you endorse what the substance.
But surely
of the
the
speech.
Quality of our political discourse should be grown up enough to draw a dichotomy. As I said at the beginning, you can think the tweet was disgusting and still think it's disgusting to send a mum of a young kid to prison for 31 months.
But we don't live in that world. We don't live in a sophisticated adult political landscape.
And what do you guys make of the Tory leadership contest? It's something that Alison and I discuss a lot. As a satirist, as a professor of international relations?
I'm glad that they're the last two. And in my heart of hearts, I hope that Kemi wins, just because she seems to have greater backbone than any of the other politicians. And we need a leader that is going to have some strength and say the unpopular things. I hope that she'll do that, because obviously people change when they become leaders, and pragmatism kicks in. But it seems to me that both of them are much better than any of the other candidates, and I can even live with Jenrick. So,
but pragmatism isn't as funny. So in a way, it's quite nice if Starmer stays in. He is funnier because he's the man who said that 99.9% of women don't have a penis.
Yeah.
And I actually did the maths on that, and it means that there are 33,500 women with penises, which is a lot of female penises. And you would think he would know the definition of that, given that his dad was a toolmaker.
And on that bombshell, that's it from Planet Normal for another week. So we leave our flying refuge of reasoned views, our sanctuary of sweet reason. No email of the week this week, but do keep writing to us at planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk as we speed away from our beloved Planet Normal and the madness of planet Earth comes back into view. Thanks this week to the fantastic Andrew Doyle, Professor Frank Furedi. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
And thank you to the Battle of Ideas!